The words did not arrive quietly. They never did. They came folded into whispers, sharpened into slogans, passed hand to hand like a weapon disguised as truth. The first slave owner in the American colonies was a black man. But wait for a second before we continue towards the video. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. It was a sentence designed to stop conversation rather than begin one. A sentence that carried the illusion of finality, clean, absolute, devastating. A sentence that traveled faster than context, faster than history, faster than empathy. Anthony Johnson's name followed close behind it, often unaccompanied, often unexplained, often reduced to a single role he never chose for himself. Proof that slavery was not about race. Proof that guilt could be redistributed. Proof that history was not what it seemed. And yet, the moment one paused, just for a moment, the sentence began to crack. Because history, unlike slogans, does not survive simplification. In the early 17th century, the English colonies were not yet the machine of racial slavery they would become. They were unstable, experimental, brutal places, raw outposts clinging to survival. Laws were incomplete, categories were fluid, freedom and bondage existed on a sliding scale rather than within fixed borders. There were no slave codes yet, no clear legal definition of black as permanent property, no inherited condition of bondage tied immutably to skin. What existed instead was hunger, labor scarcity, and fear. And into that chaos stepped a man later remembered only for the moment history froze him in place. But Anthony Johnson did not enter the colonies as an owner. He entered as cargo, long before his name appeared in court records, before it was argued over in lecture halls and online debates. He was simply Antonio, a man torn from Angola, forced across the Atlantic, delivered into a world that did not yet know what it wanted to call him. Indentured servant, bound laborer, slave. The words mattered less than the reality. He belonged to someone else. The colony he arrived in was Virginia, a place where death outpaced birth, where survival itself was a gamble. Disease swept through settlements faster than ships could replace the dead. Those who labored hardest did not necessarily live longest. Antonio nearly didn't. In 1622, not long after his arrival, the colony was shaken by one of its first great traumas, a coordinated indigenous attack that killed hundreds of settlers. Antonio was among those wounded. That he survived at all marked him as exceptional, not powerful, not privileged, just alive in a place where survival was never guaranteed. This matters, because the Anthony Johnson of legend, the landowner, the litigant, the man whose name would be tied forever to a legal turning point, was forged not in power but in precarity. Years passed, labor contracts ended, names changed. Antonio became Anthony Johnson. Somehow, through labor, endurance, and timing, he gained freedom. Not freedom as we imagine it today, but a fragile, conditional freedom dependent on recognition by men who could revoke it at will. Still, it was freedom. He married, he farmed, he acquired land. In a world where most people never owned themselves, he came to own something else, a future. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because the colony was changing. As tobacco profits rose, so did the demand for labor. White indentured servants began to outlive their contracts. They demanded land, wages, political voice. They became inconvenient. Colonial leaders needed a labor force that could not negotiate. The law had not yet finished deciding who that would be. So cases, small at first, began to shape precedent. Disputes over service terms, arguments over freedom, petitions to courts that were inventing rules as they went. One of those disputes would bind Anthony Johnson's name to history forever. But not yet. For now, the claim, the one repeated without pause, hovered above the truth like a shadow. First slave owner, first compared to whom? Owner defined by which law? In a system not yet fully formed? The past was not a courtroom verdict waiting to be quoted. It was a process, messy, uneven, shaped by fear and incentive more than ideology. Anthony Johnson did not create slavery. He did not design the system. He did not benefit from its final form. But he lived long enough to be caught inside its transformation. And when the moment came, when a man named John Casor would stand at the center of a legal battle over freedom, the colony would choose not clarity but convenience. That choice would echo for centuries, and Johnson, once a man struggling simply to survive, would become a symbol, flattened, weaponized, misunderstood. Not because he was first, but because his case came at exactly the moment when the colony decided what slavery was going to become. The story most people repeat begins at the verdict. The real story begins long before it, when survival blurred into complicity, when freedom remained fragile, and when the law had not yet decided who would be allowed to keep it. The claim refused to die because it was useful. The truth survived because it was complicated, and history, real history, was never meant to be clean. John Kacer did not intend to become history. He intended to become free. That was all. Freedom, in the Virginia of the 1640s, was not a single moment. It was a negotiation stretched across years, sometimes decades, measured in seasons of labor, in promises remembered differently by different men, in scraps of paper and spoken words that could be denied later. Freedom was something claimed, not granted, and once claimed, it had to be defended. Kacer believed his time was finished. He had labored long enough. He had worked under Anthony Johnson's authority for years, planting, clearing, harvesting, surviving the same heat and hunger that had once threatened Johnson himself. Kacer believed there had been an agreement, a term, a limit, and that limit, he said, had passed. When he left Johnson's land, he did not flee in the night. He did not hide. He went openly to another planter, Robert Parker, and entered service under him. This detail mattered, though few remembered it later. Men who believed themselves slaves ran. Men who believed themselves free sought protection. Kacer sought protection. The colony was still young enough that such disputes were common. Labor contracts were vague, records incomplete. Memory served as evidence more often than ink. Courts were less concerned with justice than with order, keeping work done, fields planted, profits flowing. Johnson did not respond immediately with the fury history later assigned him. He did not hunt Kacer down. He did not chain him. Instead, he did what the law allowed a free man to do. He went to court. This too matters, because the moment history often freezes, the black man owning another black man, did not begin with violence. It began with litigation, with petitions, with testimony. Johnson claimed Kacer had never been indentured for a term at all, that Kacer was bound for life, that his labor had always belonged to Johnson, not temporarily but permanently. Kacer denied it. What followed was not a single trial but a process, confused, contradictory, revealing how unsure the colony still was about the very idea of slavery. At first, the court sided with Kacer. It ruled that Kacer was free. This ruling is rarely mentioned by those who repeat the slogan, but for a brief moment, documented, real, the colony chose freedom. Kacer returned to Parker's land legally free, and Johnson lost his claim. If the story ended there, Anthony Johnson would be remembered as a man who lost a bid for lifetime control, a man whose authority had limits, a man constrained by a system still unwilling to commit fully to permanent human bondage. But the story did not end, because Johnson did not accept the ruling. He returned to court, not once but again, bringing witnesses, testimony, and insistence. He argued that Parker had unlawfully harbored his servant. He argued that the first court had erred. He argued that Kacer's status had been misunderstood. And slowly something changed. Not in Johnson. In the court. The judges reconsidered. Not because new law had been written, but because the colony's needs were shifting. Tobacco required labor. White servants were becoming expensive and difficult. The idea of lifelong, inheritable service, once rare and legally uncertain, was becoming appealing. The court reversed itself. In 1655, it ruled that John Kacer must be returned to Anthony Johnson and serve him for life. No crime, no expiration, no escape. This was not the first time lifetime servitude had existed in the colonies, but it was among the first times a civil court recognized it for someone who had committed no offense, and it was the first time such a ruling was won by a black landowner. That detail, dangerous in isolation, explosive when stripped of context, would echo centuries later. But in the moment, no one called it historic. They called it resolved. Kacer was returned. Johnson regained control, and the colony took a step it could not step back from. What had once been uncertain was now usable. If a black man could be held for life by another black man, the logic went, then race alone could not protect anyone. And if race could not protect, then law could define bondage without apology. The court did not say slavery. It did not need to. It had created something functionally identical. Johnson did not celebrate. There is no record of triumph, no declaration of power. His life afterward does not read like that of a man ascending. In fact, the opposite happened. As racial lines hardened, Johnson's own status became more precarious. Courts that once recognized his rights later questioned them. Land that had been his was disputed. His sons inherited less security than he had fought to gain. The system he had navigated was closing its doors, even on him. And this is where the modern distortion becomes cruel. Because to isolate Johnson as the first slave owner is to pretend he stood outside the system shaping him. It is to imagine agency without pressure, choice without consequence. Johnson did not invent the rules. He exploited an opening before it closed. He used the law as it existed, because it was the only shield he had ever known. That does not absolve the outcome. Kaser lost his freedom forever. A precedent was set. The colony learned something useful. But blame, when simplified, obscures the deeper truth. Slavery was not born in one man's cruelty, but in a society's willingness to trade ambiguity for profit. Kaser disappears from the record after the ruling. No testimony, no appeal, no trace of his voice beyond the moment it was overruled. He is remembered only as the man whose freedom was denied, whose life became a legal example. Anthony Johnson is remembered as something else entirely, and the difference between those memories reveals how history chooses its villains. Johnson would die years later, not wealthy, not secure, not celebrated. His legacy would be reshaped long after his death, molded into a sentence sharp enough to wound but dull enough to mislead. Yet the truth remains uncomfortable. The system was not yet slavery until cases like this taught it how to be. And once it learned, it no longer needed men like Anthony Johnson. It would build something far more efficient, far more brutal, far more permanent. The ruling against John Kaser did not announce itself as a revolution. There were no celebrations, no proclamations, no sudden rewriting of law books, yet something irreversible had happened. The court had discovered that permanence could be enforced without chaos, and that discovery changed everything. Before Kaser, lifetime servitude existed in fragments, as punishment for crimes, as vague extensions of contracts, as local customs applied unevenly. Nothing was stable, nothing was fully named. Slavery, as a system, still hovered between possibility and reluctance. Kaser's case turned hesitation into precedent, not because it was loud, but because it worked. Fields were planted, labor stayed put, no rebellion followed, or profit, worked for control, worked for those with power. The courts no longer needed complicated cases. They no longer needed testimony. They no longer needed exceptions. They had rules now, and rules do not argue. They enforce. By the end of the 17th century, the question was no longer who could be enslaved, but how completely, and history, always cruel in its economy, remembered only what was convenient. Johnson's name survived, stripped of context. Kaser's name survived, stripped of voice. Millions more would follow, unnamed. The transition was complete, not with chains, but with ink. Anthony Johnson did not know his name would be resurrected centuries later. He died, as most people of his time did, quietly, without ceremony, without legacy in mind. There was no marker declaring him important, no warning that his story would be torn from its era and sharpened into an argument. History moved on, indifferent to him, indifferent to John Kaser, indifferent to the fragile, violent transformation they had been caught inside. For a long time, that indifference held. Textbooks spoke of slavery as an institution, not as a courtroom moment. Scholars traced statutes and economies, not viral claims. Johnson's name appeared occasionally in academic footnotes, interesting, unusual, but never central. Then something changed. Not in history, in how history was used, as debates about slavery's legacy intensified, about responsibility, reparations, race, and memory. There emerged a hunger for counterexamples, stories that could disrupt moral clarity, anecdotes that could fracture collective guilt, evidence that complexity itself could absolve. Anthony Johnson's case was perfect for that purpose. It offered shock value. It offered contradiction. It offered a sentence short enough to repeat and sharp enough to wound. The first slave owner in America was a black man. The transformation was surgical. A man became a headline. A legal dispute became an origin story. A system became an individual. Everything inconvenient was stripped away. The early ambiguity of colonial labor vanished. The court's initial ruling in Kaser's favor disappeared. The later erosion of Johnson's own rights was ignored. The decades of legal construction that followed were erased. What remained was a single frozen image, a black man owning another black man. And that image was enough. Enough to derail conversations. Enough to confuse students. Enough to offer moral escape. But history does not operate in still frames. To understand how Johnson's story became weaponized, one must understand the difference between complexity and distortion. Complexity asks more of us. Distortion asks less. Complexity says, systems shape behavior. Distortion says, individuals explain systems. Complexity says, early colonial law was fluid. Distortion says, slavery existed fully formed from the start. Complexity says, power coerces participation. Distortion says, participation equals authorship. Johnson's life was complex. The slogan was distortion. This distinction matters because weaponized. History is not merely inaccurate. It is corrosive. It does not seek to understand the past. It seeks to use it. In classrooms, the claim appears as a challenge. In comment sections, as a taunt. in debates as a deflection, not to ask what happened but to imply nothing matters. If a black man could own a slave, the argument goes, then slavery was not racial. If slavery was not racial, then its legacy is exaggerated. If the legacy is exaggerated, then responsibility dissolves. It is a chain of reasoning built on omission. What is never mentioned is scale. Johnson's case involved one man, one laborer, one court. The transatlantic slave system that followed involved millions, across continents, generations, and oceans, constructed deliberately around race, enforced by law, normalized by theology, defended by violence. The two are not comparable. But comparison is not the goal. Confusion is. The slogan works precisely because it unsettles without explaining. It introduces doubt without offering clarity. It invites the listener to stop thinking just as the thinking becomes necessary. And yet, the deeper irony remains unspoken. The same system that later used Johnson's story to deny racial responsibility would never have allowed Anthony Johnson to belong to it. By the time slavery reached its full form, men like Johnson were no longer participants. They were targets. Free black landowners were pushed out, legislated against, erased. Their presence complicated the racial order, and so it was removed. The ladder Johnson had climbed was pulled up behind him. His life was not proof of racial equality in bondage. It was evidence of a brief moment before racial absolutism locked into place. That moment is uncomfortable because it resists moral simplicity. It shows how people can be trapped inside systems that later harden beyond their control. It shows how survival can lead to participation without authorship. Weaponized history cannot tolerate this. It needs villains, not structures, exceptions, not patterns, moments, not movements. So Johnson becomes first even when he wasn't. He becomes proof, even when his life disproves the claim. He becomes remembered not for who he was, but for what he can be used to argue. And Kaser is almost always absent. His voice does not fit the narrative. His loss complicates the punchline. His humanity demands empathy. Weaponized history erases victims first. Then it erases causes. Then it erases responsibility. The real danger of Part 4 is not misunderstanding Anthony Johnson. It is misunderstanding how easily truth can be reshaped into ammunition. Because once history becomes a tool, it stops being a teacher. And when history stops teaching, it starts repeating. The slogan survives because it feels subversive, because it promises revelation, because it offers a way out of uncomfortable reckoning. But revelation without context is illusion. Anthony Johnson's story does not free anyone from history. It binds us to it, if we let it. The question is not whether a black man once held another black man in bondage under colonial law. The question is why a society built a system that made such outcomes possible, and then expanded it until it defined everything. Johnson did not answer that question. He was caught inside it. Those who repeat his name without context are not uncovering truth. They are burying it. By the time Anthony Johnson's name was reduced to a slogan, the system that followed his lifetime had already completed its work. It no longer needed court cases. It no longer needed arguments. It no longer needed ambiguity. What had once required persuasion now required only enforcement. Slavery did not expand because of men like Johnson. It expanded because colonial society discovered that bondage could be engineered, scaled, inherited, optimized, until it no longer depended on individual decisions at all. This is where the story must widen, because focusing on Johnson is like staring at a single brick while ignoring the building rising behind it. After the mid-1600s, English colonies moved quickly. What had been improvised through local rulings became formalized through statutes. What had once been uncertain became routine. What had once been debated became assumed. The system learned to reproduce itself. The most important shift was quiet and devastating. Status began to pass through blood. Children born to enslaved women were enslaved by default, regardless of the father. This single legal move transformed slavery from a labor arrangement into a permanent caste system. It no longer required capture or contracts. It required only birth. From that moment on, slavery became self-sustaining. No court cases, no disputes, no promises to argue over. The law had solved the problem of continuity. Religion followed. Baptism, once believed by some to offer spiritual equality and even freedom, was stripped of legal meaning. Conversion no longer altered status. A person could be Christian and enslaved, baptized and owned, spiritually equal and legally invisible. This mattered because it closed another escape route. Then marriage was restricted. Interracial unions were punished. Social boundaries hardened. The colony was no longer experimenting, it was enforcing. By the early 1700s, the system bore no resemblance to the world Anthony Johnson had known. Johnson lived in a moment of transition. The generations that followed lived in a machine. Slavery expanded not by persuasion, but by bureaucracy. Plantation records replaced testimony. Whips replaced courts. Law codes replaced memory. And crucially, scale replaced exception. What Johnson's case represented, a rare, contested, legally fragile moment, was irrelevant to the new order. Slavery no longer needed unusual examples to justify itself. It had laws, profits, and violence on its side. Millions were enslaved who would never see a courtroom. Millions were sold who would never be named. Millions were born into bondage without dispute. And the system no longer tolerated contradictions. Free black landowners, once rare but possible, were legislated out of existence. Voting rights vanished, property rights narrowed, legal standing eroded. The same society that later pointed to Anthony Johnson as evidence of moral complexity had systematically destroyed the conditions that allowed him to exist. This contradiction is rarely acknowledged. If Johnson's life truly proved slavery was not racial, then why did the system erase men like him? The answer is simple: because racial slavery cannot coexist with ambiguity. The machine required clarity, blackness became destiny, whiteness became protection, law became identity, and once identity was fixed, responsibility was dispersed. No single person could be blamed, no single court could be challenged, no single moment could be undone. That is the genius and the horror of systems. They outlive individuals. This is why Part 5 matters, because modern arguments often pretend slavery was a series of personal moral failures, rather than an engineered structure. They search for villains among individuals while ignoring the architecture that made cruelty routine. Anthony Johnson did not design the machine. He encountered a prototype. The machine that followed no longer needed men like him. It needed accountants, it needed overseers, it needed laws, and above all, it needed forgetting. Forgetting how uncertain the system once was, forgetting how deliberately it was constructed, forgetting that alternatives had existed and were closed by choice. When slavery reached its full scale, it was no longer defended with anecdotes. It was defended with inevitability. This is how things are. This is how things have always been. This is how the economy works. History was rewritten even as it was happening. By the time abolitionist movements arose, they were not fighting a practice. They were fighting an entire worldview. A worldview in which some people were born to labor, others to command, and the law existed to maintain the difference. The irony remains brutal. The same people who later invoked Anthony Johnson to minimize racial slavery were defending a system that would never have allowed Anthony Johnson to stand beside them. His existence threatened their clarity, so his context was erased, and the machine rolled on. By the time slavery ended legally, its logic had already reshaped societies, economies, borders, and beliefs. Its afterlife would persist long after chains were broken, which leads to the final danger. When we reduce slavery's origins to a single provocative fact, we do not expose the truth. We conceal the machinery. We allow systems to disappear behind stories. We trade responds. Ability for trivia. Johnson's story is not irrelevant, but it is not the foundation. The foundation is law, profit, and power, layered patiently, defended violently, and remembered selectively. Slavery did not survive because people misunderstood history. It survived because people benefited from forgetting it. The machine survived because it learned how to hide itself. Not behind secrecy. Slavery was never secret. It stood in daylight, built roads and fortunes, filled ports and ledgers. People saw it, touched it, profited from it. The machine did not need to be invisible. It needed to be normal. And once something becomes normal, it stops needing defense. It becomes the background, it becomes the air, it becomes the way things are. That was the real victory of the system, not just labor extracted, but conscience dulled. So when Part 5 ended with the truth, slavery survived because people benefited from forgetting it. Part 6 begins with what came next. When the machine finally faced challenge, it learned a second skill. It learned how to deflect. Deflection is not denial. Denial says, it didn't happen. Deflection says, it happened, but not like you think. Deflection says, everyone did it. Deflection says, look over there. And the most effective deflection is the one that contains a shard of truth. That's why Anthony Johnson's story, true in pieces, distorted in the whole, became so useful. It was the perfect tool for a new kind of forgetting, a forgetting that pretended to remember. You could say Johnson's name, you could cite a court case, you could sound informed, and still lead the listener away from the machine. This is how it works. A conversation begins with the system, race-based, hereditary slavery, codified by law. Someone asks about responsibility, about legacy, about why societies still carry the damage. And then, like a trapdoor opening, the deflection arrives. But the first slave owner was a black man. It does not answer the question. It changes the subject. It forces the conversation into an argument about firsts, about exceptions, about trivia. The machine loves trivia, because trivia feels like knowledge without requiring understanding. And once the discussion collapses into who was first, something crucial is lost: scale, structure, and intent. Deflection's job is to shrink the past until it fits inside a single anecdote, small enough to dismiss, but the past refuses to shrink. Slavery was not a misunderstanding between two men. It was not a series of isolated moral failures. It was not a few bad plantation owners behaving badly. It was a total system that shaped law, economy, religion, family, and identity, built deliberately over generations, defended violently, and exported as policy. Yet deflection keeps dragging us back to individuals, because individuals are easier to judge than systems. You can condemn an individual and feel finished. You can excuse an individual and feel absolved. But systems do not let you feel finished. Systems demand uncomfortable questions. Who wrote the laws? Who enforced them? Who profited from them? Who was protected by them? Who was punished by them? Deflection avoids these questions by pretending they are too complicated, while offering a simple alternative, a provocative fact, a contradiction, a gotcha. And it works because humans are wired for stories. We remember faces more than frameworks. So the machine turned itself into faces. Sometimes villain faces, cruel overseers, brutal masters. Sometimes victim faces, whipped backs, chained families. Sometimes, most effectively, contradictory faces. Anthony Johnson. Contradiction is a powerful narcotic. It makes people feel clever. They learn the hidden history and believe they have surpassed mainstream understanding. They mistake surprise for insight. They mistake discomfort for truth. But surprise is not insight. If learning one unusual case causes you to forget the millions, you didn't learn history. You learned an escape hatch. The machine built escape hatches into memory. That's why deflection often comes in familiar shapes. Everyone did it. A true fragment used to erase responsibility. Yes, many societies practiced forms of slavery. But the question is not whether other societies did it. The question is, what form did it take here at this scale under this legal structure, and who built it? It wasn't about race. This is where Johnson is used most aggressively, because early colonial labor was indeed complicated. But complexity in the beginning does not negate what the system became. In fact, the story of the colonies is precisely the story of how ambiguity was replaced with racial certainty. It was just the times, as if time itself is a moral shield. But the times were not a force of nature. They were choices made by people with power, choices written into statutes enforced by violence, defended by courts. Look at this exception. Exceptions are used like erasers: a free black landowner here, a black slaveholder there, a rare emancipation story. Each exception becomes a tool to pretend patterns do not exist. But exceptions do not dissolve patterns. They reveal the edges of them. And that's the deeper tragedy of Anthony Johnson's life. He is not proof that slavery was not racial. He is proof that the colony was still deciding how racial it would become. His story is a snapshot of the hinge point. The machine did not begin with Johnson, but it learned something in the era he lived through. That law could shape human status, that courts could normalize permanence, that for life could be enforced without disorder. And once it learned that, it moved fast. Deflection hides this acceleration. Deflection makes the past feel static, as if slavery simply existed and people drifted into it. But the record, messy, bureaucratic, cruel, shows construction. Slavery was assembled. So why does deflection persist now? Because the machine did not die cleanly. When legal slavery ended, the structures that supported it did not evaporate. They adapted. They shifted from explicit ownership to other forms of control: legal, economic, social. And that adaptation made memory dangerous. If people remembered slavery as a design system, they might recognize design patterns in the present. They might ask who benefits from inequality now. They might question how law shapes freedom today. So deflection keeps the past from becoming a mirror. It turns history into a museum artifact, shocking, distant, unrelated to anything living. And the easiest way to accomplish that is to keep the audience arguing about the wrong thing. First slave owner. Who started it? Which group is most guilty? Who suffered more? Arguments that can last forever because they never reach the machine. Part 6 is not about silencing complexity. It's about rescuing complexity from misuse. Real complexity does not absolve. It clarifies. It shows how people trapped inside systems may participate without authoring them, how law can become a weapon, how profit can rewrite morality, how entire societies can normalize cruelty. Anthony Johnson's story is complex. So is John Caser's disappearance. So is the colony's choice to harden race into law. Complexity does not tell us no one is responsible. It tells us responsibility was distributed, and that distribution is exactly why systems are so hard to dismantle. And now we arrive at the uncomfortable pivot. If deflection is the machine's afterlife, then remembrance is resistance. Not remembrance is trivia. Remembrance is structure. Remembrance that refuses to shrink the past into a slogan. Because once the past is understood as a system, the present becomes harder to lie about. If deflection is the machine's favorite trick, then understanding is its enemy. Part 7 is where the story must be rebuilt. Not as a slogan, not as a weapon, but as a lesson. Because Anthony Johnson's life, when handled honestly, does not erase responsibility or dissolve the system. It exposes how systems are born, how they recruit people, and how they discard them once their purpose is served. This is the part most people never reach, because it requires sitting with discomfort rather than escaping it. Anthony Johnson's story teaches us something far more unsettling than the myth attached to his name. Systems do not require moral purity to function. They require incentives. They require fear. They require survival. Johnson did not wake up one day and decide to become a symbol. He did not imagine himself as an architect of slavery. He lived inside a world that had already taught him the cost of vulnerability. He had been owned. He had nearly died. He had clawed his way into a narrow space where survival was possible. And when the law offered him protection, fragile, conditional, reversible, he used it. That is not a defense. It is an explanation. The difference matters because explanation allows us to see how ordinary people can become participants in extraordinary harm. Not because they are uniquely evil, but because systems reward certain behaviors and punish others. Johnson's case shows how early colonial society incentivized permanence over fairness, possession over ambiguity. The courts did not suddenly become cruel in 1655. They became practical. They chose what worked, and what worked was control. This is the lesson deflection cannot tolerate. Because once we accept that systems can shape outcomes regardless of individual intent, the conversation changes. It stops being about finding the right villain and starts being about identifying the machinery. And machinery is dangerous because it can be rebuilt. Johnson's story teaches that slavery did not require universal agreement to become dominant. It required enough people acting in their perceived self-interest under a framework that rewarded cruelty and punished resistance. Some resisted and were crushed. Some complied and survived. Some benefited briefly and were later erased. This is how systems consolidate power. They create tiers of participation. Johnson was not at the top. Caser was not even on the ladder. The courts were higher, the lawmakers higher still. The economic forces sat above all of them. When we stop flattening Johnson into a symbol and restore him to his time, a clearer picture emerges. Early colonial society was unstable, labor was scarce, profit depended on permanence, law adapted to economic pressure. Race hardened because it simplified enforcement. None of this required a single mastermind. That is what makes it terrifying. The system did not need monsters, it needed momentum. And momentum is built from small decisions that feel reasonable in isolation. Johnson's lawsuit did not invent lifetime bondage, but it showed it could be upheld without chaos. That mattered. Not because Johnson was special, but because the court was watching. What followed was not imitation of Johnson, but expansion of the logic his case helped normalize. If you walk away from Anthony Johnson's story thinking this proves slavery was complicated, you have learned something trivial. If you walk away thinking this proves individuals are solely responsible, you have learned something false. But if you walk away understanding how systems recruit participants, reward compliance, and punish ambiguity, then you have learned something dangerous. Dangerous to systems that rely on forgetting. Consider this: once slavery became fully racialized, men like Johnson were no longer tolerated. Their existence threatened the clarity the system required. So the system erased them. That is not accidental. Systems use people when they are useful and discard them when they are not. This pattern repeats, always. Anthony Johnson was useful at the hinge point, when the law needed examples that lifetime servitude would be normalized without racial panic. Once race was hardened into law, he became a liability. So his rights shrank, his land was questioned, his legacy was reduced, and centuries later, his story was resurrected, not to honor his life, but to neutralize history. That resurrection is part of the system's afterlife. Because systems do not end cleanly. They leave residue. They leave habits of thought, patterns of blame, reflexes of deflection. And one of those reflexes is the urge to simplify history until it no longer threatens the present. Part 7 insists on the opposite. It insists that history's value lies not in comfort, but in clarity. The real lesson of Anthony Johnson's life is not that slavery was morally confusing, it is that systems can coerce morality itself. They can narrow choices until survival feels like endorsement. They can turn victims into participants without granting them authorship. This does not absolve harm. Kaiser still lost his freedom, but it explains how harm becomes ordinary. And ordinary harm is the most dangerous kind, because it does not announce itself as evil. It presents itself as normal, necessary, inevitable. Understanding this matters now because the patterns did not vanish with abolition. The same logic appears whenever systems reduce people to categories, tie identity to destiny, use law to normalize inequality, reward compliance and punish resistance, turn exceptions into distractions. Anthony Johnson's story teaches us how quickly a society can move from ambiguity to certainty, from debate to enforcement, from flexibility to cruelty. If the incentives align, that is not a story about the past. It is a warning about the future, and warnings are only useful if we listen to them. That perspective does not weaken historical accountability. It strengthens it, because it shifts our focus from moral theater to structural reality. And once we see structure, we can no longer pretend ignorance. We can no longer hide behind slogans. We can no longer confuse exceptions with explanations. History stops being a shield. It becomes a map. The machine is fully visible now. There is no comfort left in not seeing it. Once the story is understood as a system rather than a scandal, the final illusion collapses, the idea that responsibility disappears when complexity appears. Complexity does not erase responsibility, it redistributes it. And redistribution is not absolution, it is exposure. This is where history stops being academic and becomes personal, because if slavery was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, not the inevitable product of its time, but a constructed system, then every society built on its residue inherits questions it cannot outrun. Anthony Johnson's story does not ask us to choose sides in a moral argument about the past. It asks us to stop pretending the past is finished. The danger of slogans was never that they were provocative. It was that they offered an ending where none existed. The ending never came. Slavery ended legally, but the machine did not dissolve. It recalibrated. It learned new languages: law, policy, finance, zoning, incarceration, labor stratification. The logic remained: control through structure, inequality through normalization, responsibility diffused until no one could be held. And that diffusion is the final defense. Because when everyone is vaguely responsible, no one is accountable. That is why Part 8 matters more than any other. It is where memory either becomes repair or becomes another form of deflection. Anthony Johnson's life, when restored to its full context, does not excuse the system. It indicts it more deeply. It shows how a society in transition will test cruelty incrementally, normalize it legally, and then erase the transitional figures once clarity hardens. Johnson survived the hinge, Kaiser did not, and millions who followed never even reached the hinge, if remembrance stops at Triv. IA, the system wins again. If remembrance asks only who was first, it asks the least dangerous question possible. The real question is harder. What structures did we build that made this inevitable, and which of them still exist? This is where people grow uneasy, because systems implicate beneficiaries, not just villains. They implicate courts, not just overseers. They implicate lawmakers, not just traders. They implicate economies, not just attitudes. They implicate inheritance, not just intent. And inheritance does not require consent. You can inherit advantage without asking for it. You can inherit damage without causing it. But inheritance does require recognition. Refusing recognition does not undo inheritance. It only ensures repetition. Anthony Johnson's story is often used to argue that responsibility should be erased. That is the final distortion. His life actually argues the opposite, that responsibility cannot be isolated to individuals because systems deliberately prevent that isolation, which means responsibility must be collective, not collective guilt, collective awareness, awareness that the machine was built, awareness that it adapted, awareness that it left marks, and awareness that ignoring those marks is not neutrality, it is alignment with inertia. Repair does not mean rewriting history into heroes and villains. Repair means telling the story accurately enough that it cannot be misused. Repair means refusing shortcuts. Repair means saying, yes, early colonial labor was complex, and yes, that complexity was resolved deliberately into racial slavery. Repair means saying, yes, Anthony Johnson won a court case, And yes, the system that followed erased people like him. Repair means saying, yes, individuals participated, and no, that does not negate structural authorship. Most of all, repair means restoring scale. One man's case does not outweigh millions of lives. One anomaly does not undo a pattern. One uncomfortable fact does not dismantle a system. The final misuse of Anthony Johnson's story is pretending that learning it ends the conversation. It begins it, because once the machine is visible, the question is no longer what happened then. The question becomes, what are we doing now? What systems reward inequality today? What laws normalize disparity quietly? What structures benefit from deflection instead of clarity? What exceptions are we clinging to so we don't have to confront patterns? These questions do not accuse individuals, they interrogate systems, and systems hate interrogation. That is why they prefer slogans. That is why they prefer myths dressed as revelations. That is why they prefer the past reduced to a single sentence that sounds clever and ends thought. But thought is the only thing the machine cannot survive. Anthony Johnson did not leave us a lesson intentionally. History rarely does. Lessons are extracted by those willing to look without flinching. His life teaches that systems are not born fully formed. They are assembled piece by piece, defended incrementally, normalized gradually, and remembered selectively. It teaches that survival inside a system does not equal authorship of it. It teaches that power uses people and discards them. It teaches that erasure can happen twice, once in life and once in memory. The second erasure is optional. This is where remembrance becomes an ethical act, not remembrance as ritual, not remembrance as trivia. Remembrance as refusal to simplify. Refusal to turn history into a shield against responsibility. Refusal to let complexity become an escape route. Refusal to let the dead be used against the living. Anthony Johnson's name does not end the story of slavery. It marks a moment when a society chose permanence over fairness. That choice echoed. Those echoes still exist. And once they are heard clearly, silence is no longer ignorance. It is choice.